Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. So, imagine walking into a room to find a devout atheist, someone who absolutely does not believe in the supernatural or the afterlife, passionately defending the devil. Sounds like a punchline, right? But today we are exploring the intense philosophical clash between God, atheism, and the evolving symbol of Satan. We're going to unpack how a biblical job description evolved into history's ultimate villain and why modern non-theists use that exact villain as their ultimate symbol for autonomy and freedom.
It really is wild when you look at it from that high up.
Yeah, totally. And really quickly, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. We are inviting you to step right into this fascinating exploration of theology and morality today. And just to set the ground rules right up front, we are not taking any political or religious sides here.
Right, definitely not.
We're just looking at historical texts and these incredibly candid source conversations between devout believers and modern non-believers, just trying to see how they construct their entire moral universes.
Yeah, and to truly grasp the scale of this divide, we kind of have to strip away centuries of pop culture. We need to look at the raw mechanics of these belief systems,
Right.
because the evaluations of God and atheism in our sources, they're profound. They force us to ask fundamental questions about where our definitions of good and evil actually come from, and, well, how societies historically manage immense trauma.
Yeah, let's actually start with that historical piece. Because to understand the modern debate, we have to look at the literal origins of the word Satan. When you open the original Hebrew text of the Bible, you don't find a monster with a pitchfork.
No, not at all.
In fact, Satan isn't even a proper name. It just translates to, to obstruct or adversary.
Exactly. You can see this really clearly in the book of Job. The term used in the ancient Hebrew is Satan, which specifically includes the definite article. So it translates literally to this Satan or the adversary.
Meaning it's a title.
Right. It functions as a job title within a divine bureaucracy. This figure is essentially a prosecutor in God's divine council. His assigned role is to patrol the earth, observe humanity, and basically test their faithfulness.
So he's not the ultimate cosmic villain orchestrating global evil.
No. He is practically a middle manager in the heavenly court. He's fulfilling a very specific, somewhat adversarial function that's actually mandated by God.
Okay, so if he starts as this divine prosecutor, how do we get to the ultimate embodiment of evil?
Well, the sources point to a massive generation-defining trauma for the Jewish people, the Babylonian exile.
Right, the 6th century BCE.
Yes, we're talking about the complete destruction of Jerusalem. The temple, which they believed was the literal physical dwelling place of God on earth, is completely burned to the ground. The population is dragged away into captivity.
Which is just an unimaginable level of devastation.
Oh, absolutely. And suddenly they are faced with a terrifying cognitive dissonance. If their God is all-powerful and absolutely good, how could he permit or even author such catastrophic suffering?
That makes total sense.
Sure.
The ancient writers were forced to grapple with a crisis that threatened to unravel their entire worldview.
Because before the exile, the prevailing theology in the ancient Near East was essentially that a sovereign deity directly caused everything, both the triumphant victories and the devastating calamities.
But after experiencing the prolonged suffering of the exile, these scholars and scribes had to figure out how a purely good God could be the direct author of evil or temptation or national destruction.
Right.
It kind of makes me think of cognitive dissonance in a modern sense. Like, imagine a parent blaming a broken vase on a child's mischievous imaginary friend.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Because you desperately need to find someone else to blame to preserve the relationship. Is that essentially what these ancient scribes were doing? Were they just trying to solve a PR problem for an all-powerful God?
It's a really great way to put it. And the textual evidence strongly supports that kind of psychological and theological compartmentalization. Yeah. We actually see this shift happen chronologically in the biblical texts. Well, there is a story in 2 Samuel chapter 24 where it explicitly says God's anger is kindled, and God incites King David to take a census.
And taking a census was bad back then.
Right, because in that historical context, taking the census demonstrated a reliance on military might rather than divine protection, which was a grave sin. So thousands of people are punished. But centuries later, after the trauma of the exile, that exact same historical event is retold in 1 Chronicles chapter 21.
And the text changes, right? In an incredibly subtle but monumental way.
Yes. The chronicler rewrites the narrative. In 1 Chronicles, it says, Satan stood up and incited David. Crucially, The definite article is gone. It is no longer Satan, the adversary. It is just Satan.
It becomes a proper name.
Exactly. The chronicler externalized the temptation. By assigning the role of the inciter to a specific adversarial entity, they protected the concept of God's absolute goodness. God remains sovereign and permits the action, but a separate figure now bears the direct moral responsibility.
Okay, so they successfully gave the suffering a face, or at least a name, to help them process their reality. But that still leaves a massive gap for me.
How so?
We have a proper name in the text now, sure. But how does that textual concept become the physical, terrifying monster that dominates modern consciousness? Because the red guy with the bat wings and the pitchfork is nowhere in the biblical text.
Right, nowhere at all. The visual myth of the devil is a fascinating sociological tool. It's essentially a medieval mashup.
A mashup.
Yeah. As Christianity spread across Europe, religious leaders faced a logistical problem. They needed to convey complex theological concepts of evil and eternal punishment to a largely illiterate peasant population.
Oh, so they had to use pictures.
Exactly. To do this, artists and theologians borrowed heavily from the recognizable imagery of Greek and Roman mythology that was already embedded in the cultural consciousness.
Right. So they took the goat horns and cloven hooves from Pan, the Greek god of the wild, and they took the bident, which eventually became the pitchfork from Hades, the god of the underworld.
Spot on. And then Dante Alighieri's Inferno in the 14th century really cemented this terrifying, monstrous image into the Western imagination. The primary function of this imagery wasn't strict biblical accuracy, it was visceral impact. It was literally designed to scare illiterate medieval peasants into going to church.
Which is wild. And that brings us to the most compelling part of our sources today for this deep dive. If the literal physical red devil is a medieval myth designed to scare people into church, who is voluntarily claiming this figure as their mascot right now?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, our sources include a modern panel discussion hosted by Counterpoint, featuring devout Christian pastors sitting directly across from modern Satanists.
Right.
And the twist for you, the listener, is that the Satanists on this panel are predominantly non-theistic. They are atheists.
Right. They do not believe in a literal Satan. They don't believe in God, and they don't believe in an afterlife.
So why call themselves Satanists?
Well, they define themselves as part of a post-atheistic movement. During the panel, one of the Satanist representatives explains the historical progression. Back in the 1990s and early 2000s, vocal atheism acted as an intellectual hammer.
A hammer.
Yeah, it was highly effective at breaking down old, dogmatic religious systems and challenging institutional power. But once those structures were intellectually dismantled, it left a profound existential void.
Oh, because humans need more than just tearing things down.
Exactly. Human beings are fundamentally wired for narrative, for community, and for ritual. Pure atheism didn't offer a framework for those needs. So Satanism stepped into that void, providing shared values and a communal identity without requiring a belief in the supernatural.
Okay, but I find myself wanting to push back on their methodology here.
What do you mean?
If these modern groups are fundamentally just atheists who happen to highly value empathy, charity, and community, which they spent a lot of time emphasizing on the panel, why take on such a heavily loaded, intentionally adversarial label?
That's a fair question.
Like, why not just call themselves secular humanists and avoid the inevitable backlash? Isn't wearing the Satan label just an exercise in provocation?
Well, the provocation is certainly part of the appeal, but they articulate a much deeper philosophical alignment. From their perspective, they align with the literary and mythological symbol of Satan because, in the grand narrative of Western culture, Satan represents the ultimate pursuit of knowledge and the absolute rejection of arbitrary authority.
So he's the ultimate rebel to them.
Exactly. He championed human autonomy over blind obedience. They argue that secular humanism is too passive a term. The label of Satanism perfectly encapsulates their core active values: uncompromising self-ownership, the demand for empirical evidence, and the freedom to question every form of authority.
Okay, let's follow that logic to its natural conclusion then. If this modern group fundamentally rejects the authority of God and they use the ultimate rebel as their defining symbol, what exactly is keeping them from descending into complete moral chaos? Like, how do these atheists and the Christians sitting across from them even begin to define what is good?
This question formed the absolute most intense ideological clash of the panel discussion.
I bet.
The Christian perspective, articulated by the pastors, is that morality absolutely requires an unchanging objective standard. that standard is the nature of God himself.
Mm.
Because God is inherently good, perfectly just, and eternal, human morality has a fixed anchor.
Right. And one of the Christian pastors made a really stark, grounded comparison to explain this. He argued that if you remove a higher objective authority, morality instantly devolves into personal opinion.
Yeah, the pizza analogy.
Yes. If society alone dictates right and wrong, the standard is constantly shifting. He equated morality without God to a simple preference, like without an objective standard, claiming you dislike murder is philosophically no different than someone saying they dislike pizza. It is just an opinion floating in a vacuum.
It's a very striking argument. But the atheists and Satanists on the panel strongly rejected the premise that morality must be handed down from a divine authority to be valid.
So where do they say it comes from?
Their counter-argument is that morality is an emergent property of human evolution and sociology. It comes from human empathy, societal cooperation, and the shared biological desire for well-being. Furthermore, they pointed to literature and human storytelling as the vehicles for moral education.
Ah, that was fascinating. One of the Satanist panelists explained that his moral compass didn't come from the ancient texts of the Bible, but from the thousands of books he absorbed growing up. He specifically named sci-fi and fantasy authors like Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, and Robert Jordan.
Yeah.
But, I mean, come on, how does reading a book about robots or space exploration actually build a functioning moral compass that replaces a religious text?
Well, they argue that science fiction and fantasy function as modern parables. Authors like Asimov and Heinlein create complex, hypothetical societies to test-drive ethical dilemmas. When a reader engages with these stories, they are safely exploring the consequences of unchecked power, the complexities of civic duty, and the nature of prejudice.
So it's teaching empathy through imagination.
Exactly. It forces the reader to inhabit the perspectives of diverse characters facing profound moral choices. The Satanist argument is that exploring these human-generated narratives cultivates a far more nuanced and adaptable moral framework than adhering to ancient, static commandments.
Okay, but think about how we operate today, though. When you or I make a terrible mistake, our instinct is usually to look for an excuse.
Oh, for sure.
We blame bad traffic, a stressful day at work, or how someone else treated us. The Satanist perspective we're looking at here demands you strip all of that away. Without God, they emphasize absolute, terrifying personal responsibility.
There is no cosmic safety net.
None. You cannot say the devil made me do it, and far more importantly, you cannot say God forgave me to wipe the slate clean.
The psychological weight of that accountability without the possibility of divine forgiveness is immense.
It really is.
The most poignant and difficult moment in the source material came from a satanic minister who shared a deeply personal tragedy. His son had been murdered.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly heavy.
It was very intense. When the Christian panelists asked if he could ever forgive the killer if that person showed genuine repentance, his answer was an unequivocal, resolute no.
Wow. No forgiveness at all.
None. He stated that the individual incurred a moral debt that can never, under any circumstances, be repaid. He noted that Satanism draws a firm line of fire, and if you cross it, they will scorch the earth.
That is just an incredibly heavy way to navigate the world. Contrast that with the Christian perspective shared on the panel, which centers entirely on the concept of radical grace and forgiveness.
Right, a completely different approach.
The Christian view acknowledges that human beings are fundamentally flawed, deeply destructive, and entirely incapable of balancing the ultimate scales of justice on their own. So humans must rely on God's grace, a divine substitute paying the debt to find peace. It really makes me wonder about the pure exhaustion of the satanic worldview. Doesn't it get tiring being the ultimate master of your own universe? Like carrying the weight of every single mistake, every broken relationship, and every failure without a cosmic safety net or a mechanism for ultimate grace.
The non-theists addressed that exact sentiment directly. They openly admitted that, yes, taking full, unmitigated responsibility for every single action and its consequences is exhausting. It requires constant vigilance.
But they still choose it.
They do, because they maintain that it is entirely worth the burden, because it means they truly own their lives. They argue that relying on an external deity for forgiveness is a form of moral abdication. They prefer the sheer exhaustion of absolute autonomy over the comfort of submitting to an external authority.
Wow. And this philosophical split leads us directly into how both sides define the ultimate destinations of human choices, right? The concepts of freedom and hell.
Yeah.
Because how these two groups define the word freedom reveals two entirely incompatible views of the universe.
Let's examine the Christian perspective on freedom first. For the believers on the panel, freedom is not anarchy. It is not the occult phrase, do what thou wilt.
So what is it?
True freedom is defined as being rescued from our own inherently destructive, sinful nature. One pastor used the analogy of a loving parent setting strict boundaries for a toddler. A parent doesn't limit a child's actions like telling them not to touch a hot stove to oppress them, but to protect them from devastating harm.
So in the Christian worldview, obeying God's rules isn't a restriction of your liberty. It is the only actual path to a full, thriving life. And hell, within that framework, is a literal consequence.
Yeah.
It is the ultimate tragic realization of separation from God for those who repeatedly, willfully choose to rebel against those protective boundaries.
Conversely, the atheist and Satanist perspective defines freedom as the fundamental ability to experience life, make decisions, and to find meaning without any external dictatorial pressure. They embrace the freedom to navigate the complex gray areas of human existence, utilizing their own empathy and reason, rather than relying on a black and white ancient rulebook.
And because they do not believe in the supernatural or an afterlife, their concept of hell is purely symbolic, isn't it?
Absolutely. They pointed to the ancient Hebrew root of the word Sheol. Historically, Sheol referred to a literal trash dump outside the city, or the metaphorical state of being completely forgotten by your lineage after death.
Right.
So to the modern Satanist, the fiery hell of eternal torment is nothing more than a mythological construct engineered for behavioral control.
And this profound reframing even extends backward to the very first pages of the Bible, right? The Garden of Eden story. Traditional Christianity views the fall of humanity in Genesis 3 as the ultimate cosmic catastrophe.
The exact moment sin and death entered the world.
Exactly, because humanity disobeyed God. But the Satanists view that exact same ancient narrative as a story of profound liberation. They look at the serpent, the Hebrew word nahash, which carries linguistic meanings of shining one or enchanter, not as a deceiver, but as a hero.
Yeah, to them, the serpent offered humanity the fruit of knowledge, unlocking consciousness, critical thinking, and the ability to define their own destiny.
It honestly feels like we are observing a debate over two completely different definitions of a sandbox.
It's Sandbox.
Yeah, like one group believes true freedom is playing safely inside a beautifully constructed walled sandbox that an all-knowing creator built specifically to protect you from the busy, dangerous street just a few feet away.
Okay, I see where you're going.
But the other group believes freedom is the fundamental right to climb over that wall and wander out into the wild, even if it means you have to build your own shelter from scratch, face the brutal elements entirely alone, and risk getting totally lost.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The tension lies entirely between the promise of freedom through divine protection and submission versus the promise of freedom through absolute, unmitigated self-determination. Both sides look at the exact same human condition and prescribe completely opposite remedies.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you navigate your own understanding of morality? We've traced how an ancient Hebrew job title for divine adversary evolved through the historical trauma of the Babylonian exile, shifted through the rewrites of ancient scribes, and merged with Greek and Roman mythology to become a red, pitchfork-wielding villain.
It's quite the journey.
It really is. And we've seen how today that exact mythological figure sits at the absolute center of a debate between devout Christians relying on God's objective, anchoring grace, and post-atheist Satanists demanding absolute, unflinching personal autonomy.
When you distill all of these diverse sources down to their core, what stands out is a deeply unifying realization. Both the devout Christians and these non-theistic Satanists are ultimately searching for the exact same things.
Yeah, they really are.
They both recognize the human need for a robust framework for meaning. They both require a system to handle human mistakes, tragedy, and accountability. And they are both desperately seeking a path to what they believe constitutes true freedom. They simply approach the solution from entirely opposite ends of the philosophical spectrum.
It is absolutely incredible to witness how a single ancient concept can anchor two completely opposing moral universes, which leaves us with a lingering question for you to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive.
It's a big one.
If the biblical Satan started merely as an evolving compilation of ancient texts translating to a simple adversary, and today, thousands of years later, both devout believers and staunch non-believers are still using this exact figure to define the absolute boundaries of their worldviews, does this mean human beings are fundamentally wired to need an ultimate adversary just to understand who we are?